In the Campania region of Italy, near the modern city of Naples, there was a thriving Roman city, Pompeii. As a thriving center of commerce, the city's inhabitants were a mixture of elite and slaves. No matter what their social class, they all led fascinating and sometimes scandalous lives. Pompeii residents left behind a series of detailed written accounts covering everything from commerce and population to politics and everyday life. But as valuable as these documents may be, they are overshadowed by the city's preserved state, which was overcome by the eruption of the Vesuvius volcano in AD 79, located 8 kilometers from the city. While many people think of the plaster casts of human victims who died in the eruption first when they think of Pompeii, the city has much more to offer. The fateful eruption that preserved the city in all its glory may have been a disaster for most of its residents, but it left an exceptional and complete record of life in a bustling Roman city at the height of the Roman Empire and is considered by many to be the richest archaeological site in the world. My name is Francisca, and welcome to the Myths and Curiosities channel. Already leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any notifications. While the remains that people think of today are from the Roman era, Pompeii dates back to the 8th century BC. The region was colonized by a group from central Italy called the Oscans, who saw the site as ideal, thanks to its favorable climate and richly fertile volcanic soil, for planting grapes and olives and other crops. The population expanded as the Greeks moved into the Campania region, and for a time they were joined by the Etruscans. After the defeat of the Etruscans in 474 BC, they withdrew from the area and were replaced by the Samnite people who lived in the local mountains, but expanded further and moved to cities such as Pompeii. Between 343 and 290 BC, a series of struggles between the Samnites marked the beginning of Roman influence in the city. With its rich resources and favorable location, Pompeii quickly became Rome's favorite city. The city grew and prospered positively thanks to the empire that invested in major construction projects in the city in the 2nd century BC. But the city's Samnite and Oscan origins meant that it was always separate from other cities and considered itself somewhat independent of Roman rule. In 89 BC, it was besieged by a Roman general named Sulla, who wanted to increase the empire's hold over Pompeii. The siege was a success for Sulla, and those who showed some resistance to Roman rule were expelled from the city, while the remaining residents fought and were later granted Roman citizenship. Pompeii was now officially a Roman colony, and was given the Latin name Colonia Cornelia Veneria Pompeianorum in honor of the prestigious House Cornelia and the goddess Venus. Like the city itself, many of the more aristocratic residents adopted Latinized versions of their names as a mark of their assimilation into Roman society. Pompeii became an important part of the Roman trade route, with many goods arriving by sea, passing through the city on their way to Rome. Although Sulla's veterans initially took control of the political scene in Pompeii, they evidently gained the respect of Rome when several names of Oscan origin began to reappear in local government positions a few decades after the siege. After the siege, Pompeii entered a second era of prosperity, and a new 5,000-seat amphitheater was built along with an Odeon large enough for 1,500. To facilitate defense in the event of a siege. A series of gates served to separate pedestrian traffic and vehicles, such as carts carrying goods. Within the walls, the city was laid out in the traditional Roman style in methodical lines in a grid system, with the exception of the southwest corner, which is strangely chaotic in its layout. There is evidence that some of the streets operated as a one-way system. In the years before its destruction, Pompeii was a thriving city with a large population. About 12,000 people lived in the city itself, with up to a third of them being slaves. About twice as many people lived in the villages and farms around the city. Although Pompeii is inland today, at the time of the eruption it was a coastal city and was very popular with the wealthy. This meant that there were a considerable number of villas with impressive sea views. Emperor Nero had a village in or near Pompeii, and his wife Poppaea Sabina was a native of the city. Two of Pompeii's most famous visitors were Gaius Plinicus Secundus and Gaius Caecilius, better known as Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger. Both were notable figures in ancient Rome. Pliny the Elder was a natural philosopher, author, military commander, and personal friend of Emperor Vespasian. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, was a writer, lawyer, and magistrate. Pliny the Elder lost his life trying to rescue people and his family from the eruption. The wind carrying toxic gas meant that his ship could not leave port, and it is believed that he was either overcome by smoke or suffered a heart attack in the resulting confusion and panic. There are 247 remaining letters written by Pliny the Younger that are of great value to historians. Many of his letters are written to important political figures, and some are even addressed to reigning emperors. He also provided evidence of the seismic activity leading up to the eruption, stating that the Romans were used to earthquakes and tremors in the region, and did not find them worrisome or alarming as they were so frequent. He also wrote 2 letters about the eruption, 25 years after the fact, which were sent to Tacitus in response to a request for information about the death of Pliny the Elder. His meticulous description of events is so detailed that the type of eruption that destroyed Pompeii is still known as a Plinian eruption. Pompeii was an important part of the Roman trade network. A wide variety of goods passed through the city. Olives and olives, wine, wool, a type of fish sauce called garum, salt, walnuts, figs, almonds, cherries, apricots, onions, cabbages, and wheat were all exported. They imported luxury goods such as exotic fruits, spices, silk, sandalwood, wild animals to fight in the arena, and slaves. Pompeii residents had a varied diet. Along with the items they traded, they ate beef, pork, birds, fish, oysters, crustaceans, snails, lemons, figs, honey, lettuce, artichokes, beans, and peas. Wealthier citizens would have access to more of these, as well as delicacies like honey-roasted rats. Access to such a wide variety of foods is one of the reasons the area was so desirable and attracted so many wealthy members of Roman society. There were thousands of buildings in Pompeii that represent a cross-section of Roman society. There were large villas that were almost grotesque in their elegance and housing for the poorest members of society. Stores and markets reveal the ways in which people bought goods. Taverns, theaters, and brothels show the variety of ways in which people spend their free time. Temples and hundreds of shrines to deities and ancestors build an image of the residents' religious life. There were schools, public latrines, a bathhouse, a flower nursery, an exercise field, a basilica, and water tanks. All the buildings that made up a typical Roman city, and much more. Everything points to a city that is experiencing a golden age, with a large number of amenities available to the people who inhabited and visited it. Many of Pompeii's extravagant villas were built in a style that reveals earlier Greek influence in the region, and many of the houses had a private garden that often had an area dedicated to wine production. But with a third of Pompeii's residents being held in slavery, there were far less glamorous living conditions preserved, and slave quarters reveal that people lived in prison-like conditions in incredibly cramped quarters. Lower-class prostitutes tended to their clients in buildings that were little more than a curtained cubicle. Vesuvius is widely considered to be the most dangerous volcano in the world, as there are currently 3 million people living nearby. Its eruptions tend to be violent and explosive, increasing the danger and risk of living in its shadow. There were at least 11 major eruptions before the settlement of Pompeii, but the volcano would lie dormant sometimes for centuries between them, and the Oscans were not aware of the volcano's power when they settled in Pompeii. However, there were references to its earlier eruptions in Greek mythology. The demigod Hercules is said to have fought fierce battles against mighty giants in the fiery landscape around Vesuvius and the city of Herculaneum, which was eventually destroyed in the same eruption that Pompeii was named after, in honor of legends. The eruption that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum was in 79 AD. On the morning of August 24, 1,000 years of magma was released from the volcano with a thunderous explosion. Residents reportedly saw an impressive display of fire and smoke but were not immediately alarmed. It was only after a second and much larger explosion several hours later that the dire nature of the situation became apparent. Scientists calculated the power of the blast to be 100,000 times more powerful than the nuclear bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. When the residents of Pompeii began to flee for shelter, ash began to float over them, falling over everything and quickly accumulating several centimeters. As the day wore on, the ash continued to fall. The city was buried in meters of rubble, and the roofs of buildings began to collapse under its weight. Those who failed to escape sought shelter anywhere they thought they were safe, close to walls or huddled with loved ones under stairs. The final fate of Pompeii and the people who failed to escape was sealed around 11 p.m. when the ash plume collapsed and the city was hit by a pyroclastic wave. The streets were filled with a toxic gas that would have asphyxiated anyone unlucky enough to still be alive, and a heat so intense that bodies were later burned. When the last ashes fell, the city was completely covered. Meters of rubble covered a city that had once been an integral part of the Roman Empire and a desirable location for the wealthy and influential members of the Roman elite. In a matter of hours, Pompeii was buried, and it was largely forgotten until in 1755 AD local legends of a preserved ancient city were proven during the construction of a new canal. When the city was excavated in the 19th century, the residents were revealed after 1,700 years of burial in the city. Surprisingly, archaeologists realized that the skeletal remains were surrounded by pockets of air. As the bodies decomposed, the contours of their final resting positions remained imprinted in the compacted ash that enveloped them. When plaster of Paris was carefully poured into the voids, the bodies were brought back in stunning detail. In addition to the final poses, the clothes and faces of Pompeii residents were preserved. It revealed people clinging to their loved ones, curled up covering their mouths to try to escape the noxious smoke, or holding precious objects so they wouldn't be lost or stolen. Despite the stark differences in fortune seen in the remains of the city, the people who died there turned out to be on another level. The castes of the rich and the poor are no different. All the people of Pompeii died in the same tragic way, no matter what part of the city they called home. That was a sad story. And you, what you think? Tell me in the comments. And if you found it interesting, share it with your friends, enjoy it now, and leave a like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.